I was working as a park ranger at a provincial park in Canada when this happened, and it was about 20 years ago. The park was a popular place for camping and canoe trips, and I had enjoyed the area as a kid. Then when an entry-level job opened up, I jumped on it. A few years and several promotions later, I was a full ranger. My job involved patrolling one of the hiking trails that also had many campsites. The trails were just wide enough for my ATV, and I would ride around a few times each day, checking on the sites. Most of the time, I cleaned up some garbage, and on rare occasions, someone might need help. It was a pretty fun job, even though it was isolating. I almost always worked alone, and due to the remoteness of the park, there was no electricity or running water most of the time. My only communication was with a short-range handheld radio. I was often out of range anyway. In case of emergencies, I had what we called a spot. That is a small GPS tracker that I would keep on me at all times. You can think of it as a personal panic button that works anywhere. I'd never needed to use it up until now, but it was always there just in case. One day, while I was on the trail, I saw a group of people coming toward me. They moved off to the side, and I nodded as I passed. They were a few hours on foot from the parking lot, so I figured they were on their way out. I made a mental note to check their site later in the day to make sure it was clean. I wasn't sure which one was theirs, but it was quiet that time of year, and there were only a few possibilities. A while later, I turned a bend in the trail on the ATV and saw a site that I knew well. When I checked the fire pit, I could tell that it was still warm, so I figured it was their site. At first glance, it looked fine. I got off my ATV but left it running. Then I walked around for a minute or two. There was no garbage or anything, so I was about to move on. However, it was about time for my lunch, so I decided to stop there since it was a nice spot. I went and shut down the engine of my ATV since I'd be staying for a while. As soon as I cut the noise from the engine, I heard faint screams in the distance. At first I thought it might be an animal, or maybe someone joking around, but the noise kept coming, and I thought it sounded serious. I stood still, trying to pinpoint the direction it was coming from. The echo can be tricky in the woods, so I had to concentrate. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, away from the main trail. That didn't make much sense, because things would get pretty hairy as soon as you left the marked trails. I called out hoping to get a response, but I couldn't tell if they could hear me. It was just the distant screaming. I grabbed my radio and flashlight, even though it was still daytime, and started walking towards the noise. As I moved through the forest, the screams became clearer, and I realized someone was in real trouble. I picked up my pace, pushing through the underbrush. With every step, I became more certain that it was an actual emergency. My hand hovered over my GPS tracker, but I hesitated to push it. I knew that a full-on rescue crew would be sent if I did. Eventually, the person started answering my calls. Instead of random screaming, he started yelling, "Over here," and "Help." The bush was thick by then, and I could hardly see a few meters in front of me. The person was close, and it couldn't have been more than 10 or 20 meters away. Still, I wandered around in circles for a while before I found anything. Eventually, I found a young man lying on the ground. As soon as we made eye contact, I could tell he needed help. He was beaten badly and looked like he was in a lot of pain. I knelt beside him and asked what had happened. He said that his friends had turned on him during their camping trip. They beat him and left him out here to die. He seemed relieved to see me, but was clearly terrified and in need of medical attention. I told him I would get him out of there and radioed for help. Not surprisingly, I was out of range. I told him that I could use the GPS to get help, but he told me that he could walk if I helped him. Before we tried anything, I checked his injuries as best as I could. He had a few deep cuts and bruises, and his leg looked broken. When I found the broken leg, I told him there was no way he could walk. That was when I pulled out the GPS spot and finally pressed the magic button for the first time ever. While we were waiting, I traced my steps back and tried to stamp out a trail to the guy. Along the way, I was hanging a strip of bright flagging tape every few meters, just to make sure the path was clear. Help arrived very quickly, and it was a huge relief that I was no longer in charge. The guy was taken out on a stretcher and carried down the trail. I followed on my ATV and met them in the parking lot. When I got there, it seemed like the entire police force had showed up. I gave them all the details I had. The man claimed that his friends did that to him, and I thought they were the group I had seen earlier in the day. We looked up their records and were able to give their information to the cops. Of course, they were long gone already, but it shouldn't have been difficult to find them. A few days later, I received a call from the police. They informed me that they had found and arrested the young man's so-called friends. Their side of the story was different. They said that they had an argument, and they split off earlier in the day. They had no idea how he had been beaten. That was most likely a lie, because the injuries were serious enough that they couldn't have been self-inflicted. If it was just a few scratches, then that would be possible, but a broken leg, I don't think so. This happened back in 2010 when I first moved to Tennessee. I'm from New York City, but I always dreamed of a life where I could have more space and maybe even start a farm. The plot that I bought was very isolated, with no running water or grid power. Cell coverage was spotty at best, and the only possible internet was satellite. My land didn't have a house on it yet, which was fine with me. I wanted to have it built myself so I could make it exactly like I wanted. After contacting some construction companies, though, it looked like a project of that type could take time. Since I was eager to get out there, I picked up a used camper van to live in while things were getting done. The land required a lot of work, and I wanted to get started. After my first few weeks, I had managed to clear a large section of the land that I was going to use as my first garden. There was a lot more to do, though, and I wanted help. I had met one of the neighbors already. His name was Stan. When I talked to him one day, I asked if he wanted to do some work for cash. He jumped at the opportunity. Stan was an older man, quiet and reserved. He had been living nearby for years and knew the area well. I think he lived alone because I never saw him with anybody else. But like I said, he was quiet. We never really talked. For all I knew, he could be married. That was fine anyway. His place was about 2 miles down the road, and it was a rough-looking trailer, probably a double wide. Most of the windows were boarded up, and the roof looked to be in bad shape too. There was a rusted old truck parked out front, and I had seen him driving around in the area. Whenever I saw that truck, it was all over the road. I paid him to help clear brush on my property and make the land usable. It was simple but hard work, so I was glad to have help with it. At first things went smoothly. He seemed to be a hard worker and got a lot done whenever he came over. But over time, he started doing some strange stuff. He would show up at odd hours, sometimes lingering around my camper van when he wasn't even doing any work. He only came over to work a few times a week, but it felt like I would see him around every single day. The way he watched me sometimes, with a distant look in his eyes, started to creep me out. I came back from town one time, and on the way in, I saw Stan walking away from my property on my private road. When I got to my van, I looked around and everything seemed fine. I still don't know what he was doing there. The weird thing is that even after all that time, I never got to know anything about him. Literally, the only time we ever interacted was when I would pay him. Other than that, he wouldn't say a word. I suspected all along that he was into drugs, but never saw any real evidence of it. I wouldn't set specific work hours. He just came by whenever he wanted. One night, I was lying in my camper trying to get some rest. It was around midnight. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a noise outside. It was a scraping sound against the metal of the van, like someone trying to get it open. I peered through the small window and saw Stan's shadow moving around. I didn't know for sure that it was him, but it couldn't have been anybody else. He was definitely trying to open the door. The first thing I did was grab my rifle for protection. I aimed it at the door, then turned on my lantern and shouted, "Hey, what are you doing?" He looked up, and I saw his face for the first time. It was definitely Stan. He turned and tried to make a run for it, stumbling through the darkness. He went towards a pretty solid tree line on my property, away from the road, so I didn't know what he was up to. I could hardly believe what had just happened. I was shaken, but relieved that I had scared him off. The next morning, I took a walk around my property to see if anything was missing. It all looked fine at first, but then I went to the section of the forest where Stan ran off to the night before. The first thing that caught my attention was a snapped tree near the main clearing of my property. It was a small sapling, but the break caught my attention. Then I started walking around in the bush. I found several trees with marks on them. It looked like carving from a knife. Most of them seemed like nonsense, but there were a few that looked like actual words. They were mostly just random swear words. It didn't mean much, but it was creepy nonetheless. That day, I went over to Stan's trailer and confronted him about what happened. I told him to stay away from me and my property, and that I didn't need his help anymore. He just mumbled something under his breath and looked down. We never made eye contact. However, the next morning, I saw him approaching from a distance, and I braced myself. When he reached me, I laid it out plainly. I told him that I didn't want him on my property anymore. He kept his head down, and like usual, didn't say a thing. Before I knew it, Stan lunged at me. I barely had time to react, but I managed to sidestep and push him away. He stumbled forward and almost did a faceplant. I knew I had to act fast, so I backed away and ran to the van for my firearm. When I was close, I could see him chasing after me. I didn't want to risk letting him get the gun, so I decided not to unlock the van. Instead, I turned around and prepared mentally for a fight. However, when he got close to me and saw that I was prepared to defend myself, Stan turned and ran away. That day, I drove to town and reported the whole thing to the police. They came by later, but by then, Stan was gone. The cops knocked on his door, but there was no answer. That rust bucket truck of his was gone, so I knew he had taken off. Not long after, I made the decision to leave and give up on the whole project. The whole experience really scared me. It wasn't worth staying there any longer, with the way things had escalated. I knew I could take the guy in a fair fight, but he had shown that he had no interest in that. Chances are that he would ambush me in my sleep, and nobody would ever find my body. As I drove away, I passed Stan's place one last time, and the truck was back. I didn't bother getting out or doing anything, because nothing good could come of it. I just left it all behind. I spent the next few weeks sorting out a temporary place to stay, and thinking about what to do next. Luckily, I got a good deal on the land to begin with, so I didn't lose a lot in the whole ordeal. Not financially anyway. However, this experience really shook me and made me question whether I could live out there. One of my good friends from high school lived out in the boonies on a farm. Patrick was a real country boy type of guy, but he went to the high school with all the city kids. This guy literally had a southern accent and everything, even though we were in Pennsylvania. I think he was somewhat faking it, but I never cared. He was always cool, and he would have people over to his place often, in the warmer months. Me and some of our other friends went out there one Friday night. To call it a party would be a stretch, but there were about 10 of us there hanging out. Most people were drinking, but I had borrowed my mom's car to drive a few of us back and forth, so I was staying sober. It was no big deal because my girlfriend Jen never drinks anyway, and she was there too. There was some music, but other than that, it was just a quiet night with friends. We knew everyone, and no random strangers showed up or anything. It was around midnight when we left, and the drive was nearly an hour down an empty country road. I was taking Jen and 2 of my other friends who lived close by, so there were 4 of us in the car. I didn't know how everyone else was getting home, but I did know that a few people were staying the night. The 4 of us got into the car, and we started driving. We were about 15 minutes away from Patrick's place when we saw a man walking along the side of the road. I thought he might be one of my friends who decided to walk home, so I pulled over to offer him a ride. It would be hours to get anywhere near our town, and it could be dangerous out there at night, so I had to stop. I slowed the car as we got close, and when I stopped next to him, he looked over at us. My car lit up his face, and then I realized that he was an older man who I didn't recognize. He was at least 40 with an old baseball hat and a thick jacket, even though it was warm out. I could also see that he was carrying something. A long pipe, or maybe a pry bar of some kind. For a split second, I thought it was a rifle, but it definitely wasn't. Whoever he was, I knew that he wasn't one of my friends, so I decided not to offer him a ride. I just kept driving without saying a word. Rude as that sounds, I thought it was the right move. The man never tried to talk to me, and he didn't make a move towards the car either, so I thought he was harmless. There was cell service out there anyway, so I thought he would be fine. We continued down the road, but a few minutes later, we hit a giant pothole. The car jolted, and I could feel the alignment was off. We never lost control or anything, but it was jarring to say the least. I stopped the car on the shoulder and told my friends that I'd be right back. Then I got out. I went to check if there was any visible damage, but the tires seemed fine. Still, I wasn't sure if the car was safe to drive. I called Jen and the guys out to get their opinions. They all said that it was up to me, since there was no obvious damage. Just then, we saw 2 people walking towards us on the road. They were coming from the direction we had come from, so I assumed one of them was probably the man who we almost picked up. But there was another one, and I had no idea where he came from. One of them was still carrying that crowbar like before. We were unarmed out there in the middle of nowhere, and I was scared. I told my friends we should leave quickly, even though I didn't know if the car was safe. There was something unsettling about the whole situation, and the sight of the strangers coming closer only made it worse. I shifted the car into gear and pulled away from the shoulder. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figures following us, even though I knew that was not possible. We drove in tense silence for a few minutes. None of us knew what to say. I was relieved when we finally reached the town. Lucky for us, the car seemed to handle fine after the pothole, though I made a mental note to get it checked out. The next day, I drove the car to a mechanic just to be safe. The alignment needed a minor adjustment, but there was no other damage. I explained what had happened, and the mechanic told me that the car was in good shape. That was a huge relief, because sometimes even a small accident can be thousands to fix. Later on, I talked to Patrick through Facebook Messenger and told him about what happened that night. I thought he would want to know about the pothole just in case. He told me he would check it out, but said that he had never had a problem with potholes before. Later that day, I got a message from him with some pictures attached. Sure enough, he found the pothole. It was a giant crater in the road, probably the biggest I had ever seen. In one of the pictures, Patrick was standing in it, and it went almost up to his knees. It was that deep. He said that there was no way it was natural, and he thought it was made on purpose. I tend to agree with Patrick, because it couldn't just form like that and get so bad without anybody noticing. I think those two guys on the road dug it to trap us, but for whatever reason, my car survived. Maybe we didn't hit it dead on, or maybe we were just lucky, but we got away. Around 30 years ago, my dad purchased 18 acres of property in southeastern Ohio, right about where Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia meet. Think north-central Appalachia. When my father bought the land, it was a retired strip mine. Before that, it had butted up against a Civil War site, and before that, it fell along a prominent trade route for the Wyandot, Mingo, and Delaware tribes. By the time the acreage came into my family's possession, it was scrubby, depleted, and full of crumbling shale. My dad, an avid outdoorsman, intended to turn the old strip mine around to use it for camping, hunting, and fishing. He and my grandfather stocked the ponds left behind by the mines with fish, planted trees and grasses in the barren areas, and did their best to heal the land from the damage the mining did to it. 30 years later, the result was scrubby meadows over rolling hills, with a power line in the middle, and new growth forests on the north and south thirds of the property. My dad wanted to keep the property as wild and untouched as he possibly could, so any construction on the property was very primitive. There's a small shack with a wood-burning stove, a fire pit, a creaky old outhouse that haunts my nightmares, and a rifle range. There's no electricity, no running water, barely any cell service, and you can bet your ass there's no internet. As soon as it was purchased, my family began camping on the land just about every weekend. You could say I grew up there, despite the land being over an hour away from our home. It sounds amazing, until you realize that you are not, in fact, a fan of fishing, hunting, marksmanship, or roughing it in tents. That's right, I grew up in an outdoor paradise, but decided to be a more indoorsy type of child. I cried the first time I caught a fish because I was afraid I had hurt it, and I never had the heart to actually hunt an animal. While everyone was fishing or riding ATVs, I chose to wander the property by myself or find a nice spot in the sun to set up my camp chair and read. It was during these times of solitude on the property that I noticed something with the land was not quite right. My earliest memory of strange happenings out there happened when I was around 12 years old. I had been hanging out around the camp while the rest of my family were doing whatever outdoor people do. That was when I decided to take a walk to one of the less frequented ponds on the property. The route there led through a meadow with grass almost as tall as I was, and as the pond got closer, there was a pretty thick stand of evergreens and deciduous trees. As I reached the tree line, I heard what sounded like the heavy panting of a dog behind me. At first I wasn't concerned, because my family has always had several dogs. I turned around, happy to have a companion with me, and spotted our old beagle, Raccoon, out of the corner of my eye. However, Raccoon had passed away the previous winter, and his eyes weren't the same. They were vaguely human, and looked at me in this way that I could only describe as knowing. I was thoroughly on edge, but when I fully turned my head, the thing that looked like Raccoon was gone. Not wanting to turn around in the direction of that thing, I pushed onto the pond, where thankfully I found my dad fishing by himself. I told him what had happened. He smiled and said, "Sometimes these woods play tricks like that." Something similar happened a few years later when I was watching our Rottweiler puppy Titan at the camp by myself. Titan and I were sitting by the fire. I was lost in my book when a dog appeared suddenly. Titan, even though just a puppy, was super protective of me, but the presence of this dog made him cling to me and hide. The dog was like none I'd ever seen before. It moved in complete silence, even when walking over the woodpile. Its eyes were the most piercing blue I'd ever seen. Even on a husky, they almost glowed. When I looked at it, the dog made the most intense, unbroken eye contact I've ever gotten from an animal. I had the distinct feeling that Titan and I were in danger. I scooped Titan up and ran to my dad's truck, locking us inside until well after the dog left. Then my family returned to the camp. I don't know why the presence there always chooses to present itself to me as a dog, but my experiences on my dad's land is nothing compared to recent events my dad and brother have experienced. This is where my story really gets creepy. Fast forward to the autumn of 2023. My dad and brother were visiting the property just about every weekend for hunting. They arrived at the shack only to notice the bodies of small animals strewn in a circle, and the scent of decay was overbearing. The shack looked like something large had raked its claws up and down its sides. Assuming this was the work of a badger, a bobcat, or even a black bear, my brother purchased trail cams and placed them around the shack. It didn't take long for him to spot a red fox emerging from under the shack with a dead snake in its mouth. Mystery solved, he thought. That is until the next weekend. My brother and I arrived at the shack to find the fox centered on the concrete doorstep with its face entirely ripped off. No other signs of the body having been eaten were found. My brother checked the trail cam pointed at the shack, but it had gone dead at some point the night before. Thinking someone had trespassed onto the property and killed the fox, he checked the cameras lining the trails that lead to the shack. They showed absolutely nothing. Wary of predators, my dad and brother set out on their hunt. Anyone who has spent a significant amount of time in the woods knows that it can play tricks on your mind. My dad has told me stories ranging from bobcats climbing into his tree stand while he was hunting. He's shared instances of the woods going dead silent, phantom winds, shadowy figures drifting amongst the trees. He heard his name shouted loud and clear, even though he was the only person around for 18 acres. One time, as he was in his tree stand in the evening, he heard my grandpa say, "Hey bub," right over his shoulder. My dad, for a moment, thought it was his father coming to tell him that he'd been in the tree long enough, and it was time to give up and try again the next day. That was until he remembered that my grandfather had passed 15 years prior. Hugely uncomfortable, he packed up and headed back to camp. The next day, my brother and his friend arrived to join my dad's weekend of hunting. The three men set up blinds and tree stands at opposite ends of the acreage, so as not to spoil each other's hunts. In the evening, my brother heard my dad yelling his name in a distressed voice. My brother was immediately put on edge, because the area my dad's voice was coming from was not where his tree stand was. To be safe, my brother texted and asked my dad if he was okay, and if he called his name. My dad responded that he had absolutely not yelled or even spoke my brother's name for fear of scaring off the deer. Very shortly after, my dad heard a growling sound like he had never heard before. It was louder than any local predator should be able to make. When describing it, he said it was like someone with a massive speaker at full volume ran at him while playing a recording of a wolf snarling. Then the sound just stopped as if someone flipped a switch. Immediately after, he got a text from his brother saying that he would like to leave the property right then. Apparently, at the exact same time, my brother and his friend heard the exact same sound, like it was right next to them, even though all three men were on opposite ends of the property. Without bothering to take down their tree stands, the men packed up their camp and cut their hunt short to head home. They were thoroughly unsettled by whatever was mimicking my dad and growling at them that day. Since they were persistent hunters, my dad and brother returned to the camp the following weekend. My brother, more curious than cautious, decided he was going to investigate the area of the property that my dad's voice had come from. This particular corner of the land was very seldom visited because it butted up against the property line and there were no obvious deer trails in the area. When he explored, my brother found something no one had ever seen in almost 30 years while roaming the property: graves. Almost a dozen of them, all perfectly square, lined up neatly and bordered by rocks. As soon as he laid eyes on the graves, my brother knew this was not somewhere he was supposed to be. He turned a tail and headed back to camp to tell my dad. My dad was not content with taking my brother's word for it, so he convinced my brother to take him to see the graves. He brought his metal detector along because he is a middle-aged man, and all middle-aged men have metal detectors, of course. Passing over the graves, no metallic indications appeared until he got to one grave that was further apart from the others. The metal detector went nuts. My family has debated calling a forensics team to investigate the graves, but ultimately decided not to, because they are very obviously over 100 years old. We don't go near the graves at all now. We contacted the town historical society to see if there were any notable homesteads in the area, and it was confirmed that there had been. We've notified the local police department, who do not seem that concerned, so we've decided to let the dead rest. Even the allure, or historical artifacts, have not tempted us to poke around the grave that gave off metallic signatures. My family still uses the property for camping, fishing, hunting, and recreation. But things have been different lately. My dad has all but abandoned the hunting shack, preferring to camp in his camper down by the road. My brother's friend who heard the horrible growling refuses to go back there. And as for me, I know not to go wandering alone there ever again. When I was young, my family would visit our cabin a few times each year, usually twice in the summer, and then for a weekend in the fall, just before winter hit. The place was accessible all year round though, so we could technically go any time. It was a great place, but it was far away from everything. My parents, brother, sister, and I spent many days hiking and fishing. There was a small private lake about 2 miles down the road from our cabin. It was an old quarry, and there was a narrow road leading down to it, with a boat launch point there. All other sides were a sheer rock face, with no way down. My brother and I loved playing and swimming there, and it was so deep that neither of us could ever reach the bottom. We used to try, but it was useless. It was a great place to visit, and those are some of the best memories I have from my childhood. It wasn't all good though, and this is about something horrible that happened out there. Like I said, it was quite isolated, but we had one neighbor nearby. She was an older lady named Ruby who lived alone, and she stayed out there pretty much all year round. She would sometimes visit family and be away for a while, but that was her full-time home. We would often visit her, and she was always friendly with me and the other kids. My mom was friends with her too, so it was really like having another mom around, or maybe a grandma. We knew that Ruby had kids who lived a few hours away in one of the nearby towns, but she never said anything about her husband. At that age, I never thought to ask, but looking back, I would guess that he died. That would explain why she was always alone. It is kind of sad, but she always seemed happy whenever we saw her, and it was almost like she was part of our family when we were out there. Her cabin was only a 5-minute walk down a dirt road from ours, so we would visit often and always stop by to say hi on our way in. One day, like we often did, we decided to stop by her place, but she wasn't there, which was unusual because we had just seen her the day before. My parents seemed a bit worried, but they didn't make too much of it. She might have gone to visit family, they said, or maybe she was running errands in town. Her car was gone, so it seemed like she was just out. We assumed she would return soon, just as she always had before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As the days passed, Ruby still hadn't returned. I overheard my parents talking about it when I was supposed to be asleep. My dad wanted to call the cops, but my mom seemed to be in denial that anything was wrong. Maybe it was wishful thinking. At one point, my dad almost raised his voice and said, "Does she have to turn up dead before you'll do anything?" Then my mom started to cry. That was when I knew something was very wrong. Around that time, we started noticing strange things around our cabin. We found footprints in the dirt near the back door. My dad thought it might have been one of us at first, but the prints were bare feet and we always wore shoes. We also found some empty cans and wrappers scattered around near the tree line. We were always careful not to leave any trash around. My dad taught us that from a young age. Part of me thought it was Ruby out there, and she was lost, but I know that doesn't make sense. A week went by, and we still hadn't seen our neighbor. My parents were becoming more concerned, and they finally decided to call the local police to report her as missing. The cops didn't do much at first. I don't think we were able to file a missing person report on her because we weren't family or anything. But the police did tell my dad that they would check with her family. We were still hoping that she was visiting her kids in the city, but we didn't have any way to contact them. Her only phone was in her house, and calling that would do little good, if any. More time went by, and eventually our trip was over. We had to leave without ever resolving the situation with Ruby. It felt wrong to leave without finding her, but school was starting soon, and we all had to go. The next part of the story is just pieced together with what I heard from my parents at the time, as well as later. The police couldn't track Ruby down by contacting family. Her sons hadn't heard from her in weeks, and eventually they filed a missing person report. After that, the cops finally went to check her cabin. They found that the back door had been forced open, and there were signs that someone had been living there. After hearing that, my dad canceled our next trip out to the cabin because he was worried that it wasn't safe. However, he decided to go out there and close the place up for the season since we wouldn't be using it. There were some things he would do to prepare it for the winter. Turn off the water and power, and also close the shutters on the windows and block all the doors. Just standard stuff. He went out there alone, and I didn't find out what happened until years later. This is what he told me though. As soon as he walked in the front door, he heard a noise from the other side of the cabin. It sounded like a person running away, then the back door slammed. My dad went back to his car and tried to call the cops, but the call wouldn't go through right away. By the time he got a hold of them, a few minutes had gone by. In any case, there was a person living in our cabin not long after everything went down with Ruby. We were never able to prove it, but we think there were some people living in the woods around our cabin, and one of them did something to our neighbor. She was never found, and none of us know what happened to her. Her car was also never found, and in my opinion, the only place it could be is in the old quarry near our cabin. She's probably in there too.